Okay, this is the last of the 4 videos for week 1 in bioethics. This is just about the Belmont report and the history that leads up to it. Belmont report, principles come to bioethics. So you should have read the Belmont report along with the shorter documents, the Helsinki Declaration and the Nuremberg Code prior to this. This video will provide some historical background for those documents, and then in the next week we'll start taking a look at how these were applied to how these apply to the case of Henrietta Lacks. I'll take a look at the answers to the exercise that you gave, and we'll talk through those. But right now, I just want to give you some historical background. So, to start with, I want to review autonomy. Autonomy is your right to control your own life. And when we look at the history of bioethics in the 20th century, what we are looking at is the rise of the concept of autonomy as something that is important for understanding how people should be treated by doctors. And again, to further review, we said that you control your own life if your actions are free of external constraints, but also free of internal constraints. So autonomy isn't just a matter of not being controlled by other people. It's also a matter of having the capacity for self-control. There's a difference between not being controlled by others and actually being in control of yourself. We'll return to that again and again. The way that autonomy is generally expressed in medical ethics is through the concept of informed consent. And attempting to understand what informed consent is, really, is going to be crucial for what's going forward. But let's just give a general definition of it right now. Informed consent is a voluntary, communicative act. Consent is fundamentally a form of communication, something you do with words. Maybe not English words, but somehow communication has to take place, and it's made by a competent, knowledgeable adult that allows someone to do something else that they would not otherwise be morally allowed to do. I think this is an important point. Consent creates moral transformations. And we're not going to understand what consent is until we understand how it is that it can create these moral transformations. In any case, tissue samples were taken from Lacks without her informed consent, or rather used without her informed consent. I want to talk about the rise of informed consent in medical research, because what we see is in the second half of the 20th century, it goes from not being a thing at all to being the most important thing. So prior to 1947, there were almost no restrictions on the way doctors could conduct research on human beings. And there was a huge change in 1947 with the Nuremberg trials. The Nazi experiments on concentration camp prisoners were so horrific that they caused people to reevaluate the whole idea of medical experimentation. But it takes some time for this to actually set in. 1964, we're going to get something called the Helsinki Declaration, which reinforces the idea of informed consent. But it's not until the 70s and something called the Tuskegee syphilis studies become well known that the medical establishment really takes to heart the idea that informed consent is the centerpiece of medical ethics. Informed consent gets codified in the main thing we were reading for today, the Belmont Report, and then actually written into United States law in 1981 in something called the Common Rule. That was an overview. Let's go into more detail. 18th century up to 1945. Medical experiments are just done mostly by wealthy aristocrats on whatever. So 1722, Lady Mary Wortley Mortgau, pioneering doctor, also decides just to experiment on prisoners and charity children, orphans. And a lot of experiments from this era are actually quite ghastly, and the experiments conducted on animals are even more ghastly. All this changes. Oh, let's get more. Here's something pretty intense. 18th century through 1945, there are no restrictions. So in 1906, the United States is colonial power occupying the Philippines, and a guy named Richard P. Strong decides to test a cholera vaccine on prisoners in the Bilibad prison in Manila, and what he does is give people cholera, give them the vaccine, then give them cholera, and in exchange for their contributions to medicine, they were given cigarettes. But in any case, this is the sort of experiment that could be conducted. You would just intentionally expose prisoners to disease, and no one cared. After World War II and the horrific experiments that Nazi doctors conducted on concentration camp prisoners, there's a reevaluation of this whole thing. And just to remind everyone, the Nazis would do things like throw someone in a pool of ice water to see how long it would take them to freeze to death. They would also, they were fascinated with twins, identical twins, and they thought there might be a psychic connection between identical twins. So they would murder one twin in front of another and see if that affected the body of the second twin. So it was horrible. In response to this, the Nuremberg Code for Human Experimentation is established, which says you can't do this sort of thing. But at first, it's largely ignored. It's also worth noting that although Nazi atrocities get a huge amount of attention, there were other atrocities during the war. The Japanese Imperial Army had a unit called 731, where their doctors conducted human vivisection. Vivisection means cutting someone open while they're still alive, without anesthesia, fully conscious, right? So they just cut people open to poke around in them as for medical experiment, and just genuinely horrific. And nothing like the Nuremberg process happened in Japan for all sorts of complicated political reasons. Japanese atrocities in World War II never got the same attention as Nazi atrocities, and the Japanese were allowed to keep the emperor. So there are reasons for this. For our purposes, it's merely important to note that the world was full of medical atrocities and medical experiments up to this point. So this is the original Nuremberg Code, and item 1 is the most important thing. Voluntary consent of human subjects is absolutely essential, right? Also, the experiment should be done in a way that actually does some good. You can't just experiment to see what happens. And this was one of the things that both the Nazis and the Japanese were doing. There was a lot of, let's see how long it takes someone to freeze to death. And, well, you've read the full thing. I'm not going to read it out loud here. Another one is that if you're being experimented on, you should be allowed to leave. You can't be trapped in an experiment if you decide that it's too much for you. Well, what happened after Nuremberg is that a lot of doctors said, well, this is this is how we're punishing the Germans because they lost the war. And it wasn't thought to be something that people thought applied. American doctors said, well, this doesn't really apply to us. Well, there was some movement to say, no, this really is supposed to apply to everyone. So in 1964, something called the Helsinki Declaration was released. It was produced by the World Medical Association. It was founded after an organization founded after World War II to bring professional standards to doctors worldwide. It was largely, again, a product of the victorious Allies in World War II. It reaffirms the rights of experimental subjects, but it's still largely ignored. The real turning point happens with the revelation of the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. So it wasn't about Nazi or Japanese atrocities. It was about something that happened in America. The Tuskegee syphilis experiments began in 1932, and they ran to 1972. They ran for 40 years. The goal of the experiments was to observe the natural progression of syphilis in a dying patient. So it was similar to these, let's see how long it takes someone to freeze to death sort of experiments. African Americans with syphilis were lied to about their diagnosis. So patients were recruited who already had syphilis. This isn't like the Philippines experiment where American doctors gave diseases to people. However, they were lied to about their diagnosis. And in 1932, there was no treatment for it. But when penicillin did become available, patients were not told of the existence of the drug. This is important because syphilis is now an entirely treatable disease. Syphilis isn't a huge public health problem because you can treat it with penicillin. And the patients were denied this treatment that could have saved their lives. The turning point actually comes with a whistleblower. His name is Peter Buxton. And actually, like a lot of people who are important for this shift in American bioethics, he is the child of Holocaust victims. So what happens is, well, actually, first he tries to go through official channels to say this experiment has to stop. And when that doesn't work, he leaks the information to a newspaper called the Washington Star. And this leads to the establishment in 1974 of something called the Research Act, which begins to set up the bureaucracy that keeps people from conducting things like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. In order these days to conduct research on human subjects, you have to get it past what is called an institutional review board. And the job of the institutional review board is to prevent things like Tuskegee from happening again. A more complete framework for understanding this was released in 1979. It's called the Belmont Report. And a philosopher named Tom Beecham was largely responsible for writing the important content of that. And we'll be seeing a video of him next week. So the 70s changes everything. Prior to the 1970s, doctors routinely lie to patients. It was just assumed that if a patient, for instance, had cancer, you wouldn't want to tell them. It would just upset them. After the 1970s, lying to a patient can lead to a malpractice suit. Prior to the 70s, doctors made CPR decisions. Now, patients make CPR decisions. So you can assign a do not resuscitate order if you don't want to be resuscitated. It used to be doctors would give placebos all the time. Now placebos can only be used in approved clinical trials. And this is because the idea of informed consent became central to medical practice. All right, so what you read for the end of this week was something called the Belmont Report. It is technically the report of the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects in Biomedical and Behavioral Research. The committee contained one philosopher, Tom Beecham, but he wound up writing all of the important ethical principles in it. So it outlines a set of common principles to be used in making decisions in medical ethics. And you had an exercise where you had to apply those to the situation in Henrietta Lacks, and we'll talk about those details next week. Everything about the Belmont Report gets written into law in 1981 as a part of something called the Common Rule. And this covers all research funded by the federal government. It's called the Common Rule because it's common to all federal agencies. One important thing to note here is that although this writes the idea of informed consent into law, it really does only apply to research funded by the federal government, which is a lot of research, most research, because research is expensive, but not all research. The rise of informed consent has led to some important backlash. Doctors generally see getting informed consent as a bureaucratic hassle. Patients see it as a bureaucratic hassle. You show up at the doctor's office and you have to sign a bunch of forms you don't understand and haven't bothered to read. In fact, studies show that patients generally do not understand what they are agreeing to. So, one of the things we have to do now one of the tasks of medical ethics is to make informed consent something functional, make it what it was supposed to be to begin with. And that's going to be something that we're going to be looking at going forward as we study the ideas of autonomy and consent. So that's it for this week. Next week we have more reading, and we'll talk more about the Belmont Report.